It led to South Korea's numbers soaring. Because South Korea had already started ramping up diagnostic test production, they were able to seek out every member of this church in Daegu and get them tested.
The president of South Korea has put the country on the highest possible alert after the number of cases jumped to more than 760 and the death toll rose to 7.
And because of the surge of cases in Daegu, South Korea started opening up these centers.
코 또는 목에 면봉이 들어갈 때 분명하게 환자는 재채기를 할 수가 있고 그 재채기를 하는 순간에 그 방의 공기는 오염이 되거든요. 그때 생각할 수 있는 게 야외 밖으로 나와야 되겠다라고 생각을 했습니다.
Drive-through testing and special testing booths protected healthcare workers while dramatically increasing testing capacity. And manufacturers were able to keep up with the volume. South Korea also stepped up production of PPE to protect health workers and the public alike. Early adoption of testing would save South Korea. At the same moment in the United States, testing was still halted, and the nation was blind to where and how the virus was spreading.
Because of all we've done, the risk to the American people remains very low. When you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to zero, we're doing great. Other countries have not been doing great. Our consumer is very, very strong, very powerful economically.
Underneath the booming economic wave was an invisible undertow of disease. By mid-February, pandemic models indicate that there were thousands of cases spreading through Seattle, Chicago, San Francisco, and New York.
By mid to late February, the sort of top experts, Robert Redfield, Nancy Messonnier, Anthony Fauci, Azar, they decide we got to tell the president that we have to become more aggressive about warning the American public that this is where we're headed. The problem was the president just that next day left for another foreign trip to India.
Well, I look forward to being with the people of India. We're going to have many millions and millions of people.
They wanted to brief the president, obviously, before you sort of made this sort of right turn on messaging.
Yeah, we're very much involved. We're very cognizant of everything going on. We have it very much under control. Thank you very much, everybody.
And the doctors knew that this wasn't the kind of thing that you brief over the telephone, so they decided we'll set up a briefing for the president the day he gets back.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi rolled out the red carpet for President Trump.
Namaste. Namaste.
President Trump often judges events based on their size. The bigger, the better. So it's fitting that this stadium was absolutely packed with more than 100,000 people. The rally kicked off a whirlwind trip packed with the pageantry that the president so loves.
As of this morning, we still have only 14 cases of the China coronavirus detected here in the United States. We have 3 cases among Americans repatriated from Wuhan, and we have 40 cases among American passengers repatriated from the Diamond Princess in Japan. We're trying to engage in radical transparency with the American public as we go through this. This morning, Dr. Messonnier from CDC provided the usual telebriefing.
There was a bit of confusion, and it was Nancy Messonnier's understanding that the green light had been given for that new message to be delivered before briefing the president. So at her next conference call for reporters, she went to town.
Ultimately, we expect we will see community spread in this country. It's not so much a question of if this will happen anymore, but rather more of a question of exactly when this will happen and how many people in this country will have severe illness.
I remember being shocked, thinking, does she realize what she just said?
For schools, options include dividing students into smaller groups, or in a severe pandemic, closing schools and using internet-based teleschooling to continue education.
I can't say that I know what was in Nancy Messonnier's mind, but it wouldn't be hard to guess that there must have been a level of frustration built up inside the CDC about a president who doesn't take this seriously. I mean, you know, that was palpable.
I understand this whole situation may seem overwhelming and that disruption to everyday life may be severe.
Statements were made for the first time to prepare the psyche of Americans for what we as scientists knew was coming.
And I told my children that we as a family need to be preparing for significant disruption of our lives.
It was a turning point in this outbreak because the truth was finally broken through that shell of so many people standing there every day telling Americans, we have it under control, we have it contained, it's not a problem, it's going away. Those were the messages every day up until that point.
Secondary consequences of some of these measures might include missed work and loss of income.
She gives that briefing at virtually the exact moment that Trump is walking up the steps on Air Force One in India.
On a larger scale, communities and cities may need to modify, postpone, or cancel mass gatherings.
Nancy Messonnier's comments tank the market, 1,000-point drop in the Dow.
Stocks fell sharply as fear spread that growing coronavirus will slow the global economy.
It was essentially a kind of freak out.
The stock market taking another beating after a sharp new warning from the CDC. Also tonight,
Trump doesn't like to be surprised. The one gleaming, wonderful thing that was giving him and his advisors hope was the economy. It was the silver bullet. That was how he was going to win a second term. That, combined with Messonnier's threat of what she was suggesting, shut the country down, you're saying something that's going to threaten the economy and, by definition, threaten my reelection. It's an 18-hour flight back. By the time Trump lands, the whole thing had spun out of control, and he was livid. He calls up Alex Azar, wakes him up, screaming at him what had happened. You know, Nancy Messonnier had scared the shit out of people.
The CDC said yesterday that they believe it's inevitable that the virus will spread in the United States, and it's not a question of if, but when. Do you agree with that assessment?
Whatever happens, we're totally prepared. We have the best people in the world.
Notably missing from the best people in the world was Dr. Nancy Messonnier.
It didn't surprise me that the moment she said that she would be removed from that platform.
I'm going to be announcing exactly right now that I'm going to be putting our Vice President, Mike Pence, in charge. I'm going to ask Mike Pence to say a few words, please. Thank you, Mike.
After the episode with Nancy Messonnier, when Pence's team takes over from Azar, essentially the message gets contained.
You don't feel like you're being replaced?
Not in the least. I was delighted that I get to have the vice president helping in this way. Delighted. Absolutely.
Now at the helm of the task force, Pence promptly promoted Deborah Birx, a doctor and a diplomat, to be a spokesperson.
Dr. Birx, who is our right arm at the White House on this, and frankly one of the leading experts in the world on infectious disease, I think is...
Pence trusted Birx on account of her Christian faith and political instincts. She'd become a go-to explainer for a White House interested in packaging science to serve partisan goals.
We really want to understand where the virus is spreading, who we have to protect, who's the most vulnerable.
That would have been easy to understand if there had been a national testing program, but that was still stalled. While countries all over the world were testing thousands of cases, the United States was testing fewer than 100 a day.
At that stage, the only labs across the country that could legally test for COVID were a few public health laboratories and the CDC itself.
The frustration was just boiling over. And I remember going to these meetings with our clinical lab director, and she's literally on the phone with the FDA and the CDC like, you need to help us. You need to help us.
After almost a month of labs across the country being unable to test, the Trump administration finally made a decision it could have made weeks earlier.
On February 26th, the FDA and the CDC laid out the strategy. And that was that we would be able to get up and running by using the original test kit, but by throwing out the N3 component.
Overnight, with some crossing out of lines on some paper, the same test kits that had been shipped out to the state public health labs were functional. That amended EUA was Wednesday, February 26th. And you can watch the testing curve in the United States. I mean, it really didn't start going up until that week. Here in Washington State, at the state lab, they had positive results the very first time they performed authorized tests.
After desperate pleas from healthcare providers, the FDA also relaxed regulations and let manufacturers and hospital labs use their own tests. But it was too little, too late. The disease had spread to half the states in the country. And test kits were in such short supply that they were limited to patients who met rigid guidelines set by the CDC.
Early on, our testing was limited to people who had traveled from China or they'd had contact with someone who was known tested positive for COVID-19. So written in our guidelines, by necessity, because we had a strained testing supply, it was designed to miss community transmission, meaning transmission that happens throughout the community that's not connected to travel, that we know at some point is going to happen. And it's like we're looking in this area and we know that transmission is going to happen over here and we're going to miss it because we can't test for it.
On February 27th, the new testing recommendations came out.
Do you mind removing the mask? Is that okay?
Oh, no, not at all. I didn't know what your rules of engagement were here, so.
The new addition was this line that said, if you have severe lower respiratory pneumonia or ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome, you should consider testing.
With the updated guidelines, we initiated testing in 2 individuals, and both of those individuals tested positive.
So that evening, after we got the first 2 back, we looked around the intensive care unit and said, okay, who else is sick with pneumonia that has not been diagnosed with influenza or another respiratory virus? And we selected 9 more individuals. 8 of those turned out to be positive for COVID. It was an astounding revelation.
The revelation was that while testing protocols were on hold, the disease had spread uncontrollably, which would lead to economic disaster and the loss of tens of thousands of lives.
The real question is, did more people die? Did more dislocation and economic problems and societal change have to happen than did? The period that in our reporting that we have called the lost month, that really was the time when things happened in the United States much more slowly than they happened in, for example, South Korea. And it became impossible to do containment.
Because the U.S. failed to contain the virus, state governments moved to lockdowns to avoid runaway contagion and to prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed. Over 100,000 small businesses would close and never reopen. 7 million Americans would be infected by the disease. But back in late February, the government refused to confront the reckoning that was about to come.
We have done an incredible job. We're going to continue. It's going to disappear. One day, it's like a miracle, it will disappear.
The president is also quoted by saying, the virus we're talking about having to do, a lot of people think it goes away in April with the heat. Dr. Fauci, does this go away in April?
If it acts like influenza, the heat will actually make it diminish in its impact. But we have no way of knowing how it's going to act.
Does the CDC agree that this is a problem that is going to go away without intervention?
I think it's prudent to assume that this pathogen will be with us for some time to come.
The president's expressing confidence, this team, the public health infrastructure in this country, state and local, that we can deal with this. We will prepare for this. We will work together on this. He's trying to calm a public that we see in China. Panic can be as big of an enemy as virus in these situations. And so there is always that balance.
Mr. Secretary, I don't want to panic over this either. The stock market's crashing. He's outright contradicting everything that you all have just said. outright contradiction.
I think he's expressing confidence in...
With no medical basis for it. That's what you've just explained to us. Come on, sir.
The gentleman's time has expired. You're doing a great job for the president, Mr. Secretary.
Now the Democrats are politicizing the coronavirus. You know that, right? Coronavirus. One of my people came up to me and said, Mr. President, they tried to beat you on Russia, Russia, Russia. They tried the impeachment hoax. And this is their new hoax. And so far, we have lost nobody to coronavirus in the United States. Nobody.
The next day, that would change.
Today, Public Health Seattle and King County is announcing 3 new presumptive positive cases of novel coronavirus, COVID-19, including 1 person who died.
We have expressed our condolences to the families of the individual who has passed away.
It was one of the first 2 patients diagnosed. It was my patient. And all we saw was a future of extremely ill individuals like this. So it was a challenging moment, a daunting moment, to come to that realization.
Today, health officials in Washington state announced 4 new deaths, bringing the total to 6, all in the Seattle area.
By early March, King County, Washington had become the epicenter of the coronavirus in the U.S. due to the Life Care nursing home.
They're not answering the phones, the lines are busy, all the families are really worried, not knowing if our loved ones are even alive.
It was a blur of activity. We realized that our hospital was now the tip of the iceberg. We soon found out how deep that iceberg went.
Because test kits were in short supply, access was limited to patients who were dangerously close to respiratory failure. The death count began to rise. COVID began spreading to healthcare workers and first responders.
The job situation put them at increased risk. Nurses' aides in nursing homes without the protective equipment or training they needed to be safe and secure. Individuals who have jobs that were considered essential jobs. They're stocking grocery shelves and helping to pick up trash in communities and sweep the streets.
While many affluent Americans worked on computers at home, low-paid essential workers, many without masks and the ability to distance, were jammed into sites of contagion like delivery depots, industrial farms, factories, funeral homes, and meatpacking plants. If the impact of the disease was divided by occupation, it was also sundered by age and race.
My grandmother used to say, you know, when the country gets the flu, black people get pneumonia. It's well known in our circles that we have worse outcomes when it comes to a lot of these different diseases. You know, and part of that is systemic racism. A lot of it is access to health care.
If you have the money, you can get the best health care in the world, but without those resources, you have inadequate care and sporadic care. So any kind of disease spread then falls hardest on communities that are already at health risk.
What are we dealing with this coronavirus, COVID-19?
We're dealing with clearly an emerging infectious disease that has now reached outbreak proportions and likely pandemic proportions.
The Grand Princess cruise ship has been moored off the coast of California. I want to commend the efforts of our Coast Guard that heroically flew coronavirus tests to the ship. 21 tested positive for the coronavirus.
On his way to a weekend trip at Mar-a-Lago, Trump made a stop at the CDC.
Watching the president go to the Centers for Disease Control, he discussed with a reporter the fact that one of the cruise ships was still offshore.
I'd rather have them stay on because I like the numbers being where they are. I don't need to have the numbers double because of one ship.
For the first time, it occurred to me that the government of the United States was intentionally slow-walking testing.
In this big, vast land of ours, this great country of ours, we have 240 cases. Most of those people are going to be fine. A vast majority are going to be fine. We've had 11 deaths.
All of our state labs now have the ability to test for this virus.
And they have had. The testing has been amazing, actually, what they've been able to produce in such a short period of time. Anybody that wants a test can get a test.
Anybody who wanted a test knew that was a lie. Just finding a facility was hard. People with the disease were denied tests on account of supply backlogs, which also caused delays in results. The next day, while Trump golfed, Pence and Redfield went to Cruise Lines of America.
We all recognize the recent challenges on the Diamond Princess and the ongoing challenge with the Grand Princess. We want to ensure that the American people can continue, as we deal with the coronavirus, to enjoy the opportunities in the cruise line industry and be confident.
I would not encourage anyone to change their plans at this point based on what the epidemiology is here in Florida. They should enjoy Disneyland. They should enjoy the rest of Florida.
There is this back and forth. The medical folks saying we need to take this seriously, we need to be aggressive. The economic folks pushing back and saying, yeah, but Fauci would march up and answer questions.
Do you believe that people, even if they're healthy, should get on board a cruise ship?
I would recommend strongly that they do not go on a cruise ship.
And then Trump or Pence would come back and sort of contradict them.
We're going to work with the cruise line industry to improve the safety, improve the health environment on cruise lines.
Frankly, the testing has been going very smooth. If you go to the right agency, if you go to the right area, you get the test.
Will you admit that there is a serious problem in this country obtaining access to testing for coronavirus?
My colleague is looking at me to answer. Here we go.
Okay.
The system is not really geared to what we need right now. That is a failing.
Failing, yes.
It is a failing. I mean, let's admit it.
Dr. Fauci said earlier this week that the lag in testing was, in fact, a failing. Do you take responsibility for that?
Yeah, no, I don't take responsibility at all. We're doing a great job. We have 40 people right now, 40. Compare that with other countries that have many, many times that amount. To keep new cases from entering our shores, we will be suspending all travel from Europe to the United States for the next 30 days.
There was a problem with Trump's sudden travel ban. It had no plan attached.
If we do get back to the U.S., then what happens? Do we go into quarantine? Do we go home?
Returning Americans flooded U.S. airports where they were jammed in makeshift COVID checkpoints. There were perfect conditions for more contagion as travelers from Europe spread the virus into the U.S.
The message to New Yorkers from the beginning has been, this is something we all can handle together. Go about your lives, go about your business.
The governor confirming that coronavirus has arrived here in Manhattan.
The coronavirus spreads tonight as Governor Cuomo announces 5 more positive cases in New York.
The number of confirmed cases has reached 121.
Today, Governor Cuomo announcing a ban on any gatherings of 500 people or more.
And 613 confirmed cases of coronavirus in New York. That is more than any other state.
I'm glad to see that you're practicing social distancing. That looks very nice. We're announcing new guidelines for every American to follow. Avoid gathering in groups of more than 10 people, and avoid eating and drinking at bars, restaurants.
And if everybody in America does what we ask for, we will see a dramatic difference, and we won't have to worry about the ventilators, and we won't have to worry about the ICU beds.
Our volume is just exploding. We have so many people in the hallways.
A day or so ago, we put 14 people on ventilators.
Mayor de Blasio says that there have been 100 new cases in the city today alone.
So we're going to put out an executive order today. New York State on pause.
19 million New Yorkers are being asked to stay at home as much as possible.
Now topping 85,000 confirmed cases and more than 1,400 deaths.
I hate to say this, but it's true. We are now the epicenter of this crisis right here in the nation's largest city.
If this goes on for a month or 2 or 3 or 5 like it did in China, we don't have what we need.
This is not a country that was built to be shut down. We're not going to let the cure be worse than the problem.
Worried about the economy, Trump tried to limit shutdowns, but the virus was out of control. By April, over 3,000 New Yorkers had died, surpassing the death toll of 9/11. ICUs were over capacity with patients who couldn't breathe. Ventilators were in short supply, and many of those who got them did not survive.
We had seen the pandemic was really taking off in New York City. We were in a central area of Virginia where there's not a huge population. And it was like being on a coastal city and you hear about an earthquake that happens offshore. You know that a tsunami is coming. You just don't know when it's going to happen and how severe it's going to be.
A U.S. Marine in Virginia has tested positive for the coronavirus. This is the first positive case in Virginia, and here's what we know.
I remember one day I was rounding in our COVID ICU, and our unit is structured kind of like a V, so there's one wing here, another wing over there. And these are some of the sickest patients I've ever taken care of in my life. They're on breathing machines, dialysis machines, and they're needing lots of medicines to keep them sedated and calm. And I'm trying to get through morning rounds, and I see that on one wing, it's almost all Hispanic last names. And then on the other wing, it's almost all Black names. I grew up an hour away from where I'm working. These are the family names that I grew up with, and I know these families. And I just was trying to focus on the medical part and just getting through it, but I just felt this weight on my chest. I'm a Black male in the United States, and my family members have chronic diseases at high rates. And I've been dealing with this my whole life. And now I have family members who are contracting COVID. Those are smiles and hugs and tears and barbecues. They're not numbers on a paper.
Through the spring, the death toll would rise to 100,000. It was a terrifying marker for the failure of the American response. The U.S. was 4% of the world's population and 20% of the deaths from the virus. Despite the fatal consequences of inaction, the government could not solve basic problems like supplies for test kits.
In March, we started to see the global supply chain really get jammed up. So it was extraction kits, swabs.
The major producer of swabs is in the Lombardy region of Italy. And Italy had just gone on lockdown, and the swabs company was in a no-fly zone. So the U.S. supply is basically going to grind to a halt.
Every single step of the way, we've encountered an issue or a problem with the supply chain.
Potential supply chain problems had been identified in Crimson Contagion. The focus was on testing supplies and life-saving PPE. The most critical items needed were N95 masks, whose firm fit and tight mesh offered healthcare workers real protection from the disease.
We had estimated the number of N95 respirators that would be needed. That number was 3.5 billion. And we had a fraction of what we would need in the stockpile. And all of those had a 5-year shelf life. And a lot of those, they were purchased almost 10 years ago.
Despite Ebola, despite Zika, despite H1N1, filling up the national stockpile for some virus that we don't even know is ever going to come has never been the top priority. You can say the Obama administration didn't do enough to leave the next administration prepared. You can also say, well, that's true, but the Trump administration had 3.5 years.
The Strategic National Stockpile was not intended to be everything that we would need for an entire crisis. I think in mid-January, the U.S. government should have been looking at the stockpile to see what was in it and how we were going to pivot to manufacture more. We should have been having the conversation about the Defense Production Act in January.
There's talk of invoking war powers to require U.S. companies to manufacture some goods.
That's right. So that's called the Defense Production Act. I believe it came into existence during the Korean War. Effectively, we can determine that our production should get to the front of the line. We'll use it if we need to, but we obviously, if we can work cooperatively with any vendor, we'd rather do that.
Let the market work its magic. That was the guiding philosophy for Azar and Trump. But their anti-government strategy ignored basic rules of supply and demand.
Without a large order from the United States government, there really wasn't an incentive for these companies to start maximizing their throughput. I was getting reports from Mike Bowen, one of the few remaining producers of face masks and respirators in the United States, who had his finger on the pulse of the supply chain.
I'm a salesman telling a story that nobody believes. The story is that the U.S. mask supply is going to collapse and people are going to die. It doesn't cost much to fix. That's the story. Around 2005, all of the major mask makers left the country. It put the U.S. mask supply in the hands of foreign control and could be subject to diversion during a pandemic. And that's what I've been warning about for years. I wrote Barack Obama 20 letters. Tell America's hospitals that they are going to be in a position to not be able to protect their staff and their patients. I voted for Donald Trump. I thought, you know, if I contact enough people in the administration, somebody, one of these people are going to look at this and go, hey, this is a problem. Maybe we ought to call this guy. And no, I didn't get any response there.
In January, Bowen's predictions came true. As China struggled to contain the outbreak of COVID, it limited the export of N95 masks to the United States.
At the end of January, I'm hearing from all over the world, people are freaking out about masks and needing masks. And that's when I got a hold of Rick and said, hey, here's what I'm seeing out here. This is going to be bad.
He was sounding the alarm bells almost every day.
Can't protect America's population. That's too late. But I said, I can at least make enough masks to protect America's healthcare workers. I reminded him that we had these 4 respirator lines. To activate them, we would need more people, raw materials, emergency NIOSH approval, and large, non-cancelable orders. I see that our country's going to have a problem. I get a hold of Rick.
I pushed every one of those emails up to the Strategic National Stockpile and Critical Infrastructure team. I reminded them of the H5N1 scare when people rushed to buy masks and hoard masks. The response I got was, we will just change the CDC guideline. And we'll just tell people, don't do that.
Basically in March, they realized that the healthcare workers are not going to have enough PPE. So they basically issue a warning to the public, do not use face masks.
Do you have any sense of how many more N95 masks would be on the market had the federal government taken you up on your offer to reactivate N95 manufacturing lines in January?
About 7 million N95 respirators per month.
I sounded the alarm every day about the shortage of N95 respirators, and we were doing nothing.
The numbers continue to surge in hotspots like California, Michigan, Louisiana, Florida, and especially, of course, New York. Medical resources are stretched to capacity and beyond.
We had saved some outdated N95 masks that were part of the Ebola response, but quickly we ran out of those supplies, so we had to make do.
Some of the N95 masks that we received have been in storage for years and years, and while the actual mask itself worked fine, the rubber band was brittle. So there are people in the room taking care of a patient, and the mask just snaps off.
The CDC is now advising healthcare workers to ration masks, to use expired masks, even